The Magic Finger 2. Late that night, after Philip and William had to go to bed, Mr. Gregg went outside to get some wood for the fire. He was crossing the yard when all at once he heard the sound of the white duck in the sky. He stopped and looked up. The night was very still. There was a thin yellow moon over the trees on the hill, and the sky was filled with stars. Then Mr. Gregg heard the noise of wings flying low over his head, and he saw the 4 ducks, dark against the night sky, flying very close together. They were going around and around the house. Mr. Gregg forgot about the firewood and hurried back indoors. He was now quite afraid. He did not like to what was going on, but he said nothing about it to Mrs. Gregg. All he said was, "Come on, let's go to bed. I feel tired." So they went to bed and slept. When next morning came, Mr. Gregg was the first to wake up. He opened his eyes. He was about to put out the hand for his watch to see the time, but his hand wouldn't come out. "That's funny," he said. "Where is my hand?" He lay still, wondering what was up. Maybe he had hurt that hand in some way. He tried the another hand. That wouldn't come out either. He sat up. When, for the first time, he saw what he looked like, he gave a yell and jumped out of bed. Mrs. Gregg woke up, and when she saw Mr. Gregg standing there on the floor, she gave a yell too, for he was now a tiny little man. He was maybe as tall as the seat of a chair, but no taller. And where his arms had been, he had a pair of jack's wings instead. But, cried Mrs. Gregg, going purple in his face. "My dear man, what happened to you?" "What happened to both of us, you mean?" shouted Mr. Gregg. It was Mr. Gregg's turn now to jump out of bed. She leaned to look at herself in the grasses, but she was not tall enough to see into it. She was even smaller than Mr. Gregg, and she, too, had got wings instead of arms. Oh, sobbed Mrs. Gregg. This is Witch's Rock," cried Mr. Gregg, and both of them sat running around the room, flapping their wings. A minute later, Philip and William burst in. The same things had happened to them. They had wings and no arms, and they were really tiny. They were about as big as robins. Mama, shouted Philip. "Look, Mama, we can fly!" And they flew into the air. "Come down at once," said Mrs. Gregg. "You're much too high." But before she could say another word, Philip and William had flown right out the window. Mr. and Mrs. Gregg ran to the window and looked out. The 2 tiny boys were now high up in the sky. When Mrs. Gregg said to Mr. Gregg, "Do you think we could do that, my dear?" "I don't see why not," Mr. Gregg said. "Come on, let's try." Mr. Gregg began to flap his wings hard, and all at once off he went. Then Mrs. Gregg did the same. "Help!" she cried as she started going off. "Save me!" "Come on," said Mr. Gregg. "Don't be afraid." So out the window they flew, far off into the sky, and it did not take them long to catch up with Philip and William. Soon the whole family was flying around and around together. "Oh, isn't it lovely?" cried William. "I always wanted to know what it feels like to be a bird." "Your wings are not getting tired, are they, dear?" Mr. Gregg asked Mrs. Gregg. "Not at all," Mrs. Gregg said. "I could go on forever." Hey, look down there," said Philip. "Somebody is walking in our garden." They all looked down, and there below them, in their own garden, they saw 4 enormous white ducks. The ducks were biggest as men, and what is more, they had great long arms, like men, instead of wings. The ducks were walking out in a line to the door of the Gregg's house, swishing their arms and holding their baskets into the air. "Stop!" called the tiny Mr. Gregg, flying down over their hands. "Go away! That's my house!" The ducks look up and quack. The first one put out a hand and opened the door of the house and went in. The others went in after him. The door shut. The geese flew down and sat on the wall near the door. Mrs. Gregg began to cry. Oh dear, she sobbed. They have taken our house. What shall we do? What shall we do? We have no place to go. Even the boys began to cry a bit now. We will be eaten by a cat and fox in the night, said Philip. I want to sleep in my own bed, said William. Now then, said Mr. Gregg. It isn't any good crying. That won't help us. Shall I tell you what we are going to do? What? They said. Mr. Gregg looked at them and smiled. We are going to build a nest. A nest, they said. Can we do that? We must do it, said Mr. Gregg. We've got to have somewhere to sleep. Follow me. They flew off to a tall tree and right at the top of it, Mr. Gregg chose the place for the nest. Now we want sticks, he said, lots and lots of little sticks. Off you go, all of you, and find them and bring them back here. But we have no hands, said Philip. Then use your mouth. Mrs. Gregg and the children flew off. Soon they were back, carrying sticks in their mouths. Mr. Gregg took the sticks and started to build the nest. More, he said. I want more and more and more sticks. Keep on, keep going. The nest began to grow. Mr. Gregg was very good at making the sticks stick together. After a while, he said, that's enough sticks. Now I want to leaves and feathers and things like to make the inside nice and soft. The building of the nest went on and on. It took a long time, but at last it was finished. Try it, said Mr. Gregg, hopping back. He was very pleased with his work. Oh, isn't it lovely, cried Mrs. Gregg, moving at it and sitting down. I feel might I lay in my at a moment. The others got in beside her. How warm it is, said William. And what fun to be living so high up, said Philip. We may be small, but nobody can hurt us up here. But what about food, said Mrs. Gregg. We haven't had the things to eat all day. That's right, said Mr. Gregg said. So we will now fly back to the house and go by and open the window and get the tin of biscuits when the dogs aren't looking. Oh, we will pack the biscuits by those dirty great dogs, cried Mrs. Gregg. We shall be very careful, my love, said Mr. Gregg, and off they went. But when they got to the house, they found all the windows and the door closed. There was no way in. Just look at that beastly dog cooking at my softs, cried Mrs. Gregg as she threw past the kitchen window. How dare she? And look at that one holding my lovely gun, shouted Mr. Gregg. One of them is lying in my backyard, William, looking into top window, and one of them is playing with my electric trains, cried Philip. Oh dear, said Mrs. Gregg. They have taken over our whole house. We shall never get it back. And what are we going to eat? The end.